The sleek black Bentley glided to a stop outside Harrison Enterprises' gleaming headquarters in downtown Boston. Madison Foster took a deep breath, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the leather steering wheel as she studied her reflection in the rearview mirror. 7 years had transformed her from the naive small-town girl into someone barely recognizable. Someone stronger, harder, yet infinitely more dangerous. Her once wild honey-blonde curls were now smoothed into an elegant shoulder-length cut, and designer clothes had replaced the modest outfits she used to wear. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. Where warmth and trust once lived, there was now only cold determination. "Mommy, are we there?" A small voice called from the back seat, pulling Madison from her thoughts. In the mirror, she caught sight of her 6-year-old twins, Ethan and Emma, their faces carbon copies of their fathers with those striking blue eyes and dimpled cheeks. The sight of them still made her heart clench. They were both her greatest joy and her most powerful weapon. "Yes, sweethearts. This is where Mommy needs to have her meeting. Remember what we talked about? You'll stay with Aunt Sarah at the hotel and have a super fun afternoon at the pool." Madison turned to give them a reassuring smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah, her closest friend and the only person who knew the full truth about her past, would keep the twins safe while Madison set her plan in motion. "But why can't we come with you?" Emma asked, her little face scrunching up in confusion. "You said we'd get to meet Dash." "Not today, baby," Madison cut in gently but firmly. "Soon though, I promise." She checked her watch, 9:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, she had an appointment with the HR department of Harrison Enterprises under the name Madison Reynolds, applying for the position of executive assistant to the CEO. The same CEO who had thrown her out of his life 7 years ago, destroying everything she thought she knew about love and trust. As she stepped out of the car, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and possibility, Madison's mind drifted back to that rainy night in November. She had been 23, pregnant but not yet knowing she carried twins, when Blake Harrison had coldly informed her their marriage had been a mistake. "You were a fun distraction," he'd said, his voice as empty as his heart must have been, "but it's time to face reality. You don't belong in my world, Maddie. You never did." Now, watching the twins climb into Sarah's waiting car, Madison allowed herself a small, dangerous smile. Blake Harrison had no idea how much his world was about to change. She had spent 7 years building herself into someone who could not only survive in his world but dominate it. And she was going to make him regret every word, every action, every moment of pain he had inflicted on her. Madison straightened her Chanel blazer and walked toward the building's entrance, her Louboutin heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown. The security guard held the door open with a respectful nod, not knowing he was letting in the harbinger of his boss's destruction. As she crossed the marble lobby, Madison's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "The kids are settled. Remember, revenge might be sweet but don't let it poison you. You're better than him." But was she? Madison wondered as she stepped into the elevator. 7 years ago she might have been. But Blake Harrison had taught her the most valuable lesson of all. In this world, being better meant nothing. Power was everything. And she was about to show him just how well she'd learned that lesson. The elevator ascended silently to the 30th floor, giving Madison precious moments to settle into character. Her new persona, Madison Reynolds, was confident, competent, and completely unfamiliar to Blake Harrison. She had manufactured a flawless resume over the years, working her way up through competitor companies, ensuring that when this moment came, no one could question her qualifications. The doors opened to Harrison Enterprises' executive floor, and she stepped out into the familiar space that now felt like entering enemy territory. Jessica Chen, the HR director, greeted Madison with a warm smile that almost made her feel guilty. "Almost. Mrs. Reynolds, thank you for coming in. Your references are impressive." She led Madison through the open office space, past rows of desks where she once walked as Mrs. Harrison, now unrecognizable to the few employees who remained from those days. 7 years, a different name, and a complete transformation had its advantages. "Please call me Madison," she replied smoothly, her voice carrying none of the southern twang that Blake had once found so charming. Years of careful speech coaching had eliminated that particular reminder of her humble beginnings. As they walked, Madison caught her reflection in the glass walls, sleek, polished, dangerous. Nothing like the wide-eyed girl who had once decorated the Christmas tree in Blake's penthouse office, singing carols off-key while he pretended to be annoyed but couldn't hide his smile. The interview proceeded exactly as Madison had planned. She presented herself as the perfect candidate, overqualified if anything, but looking for a position that offered unique challenges. Jessica was clearly impressed, but the final decision would rest with Blake himself. Mr. Harrison likes to personally approve all executive-level staff, Jessica explained. He should be finishing up his current meeting any minute now. Right on cue, Blake's office door opened. Madison's heart stuttered for a fraction of a second before steel determination took over. He looked exactly the same, devastatingly handsome in his bespoke suit, with those piercing blue eyes that their children had inherited. The only difference was the slight dusting of gray at his temples, which annoyingly only made him more attractive. "Mr. Harrison," Jessica called out, "do you have a moment to meet our candidate for the EA position?" Blake turned, his expression professionally neutral as his eyes fell on Madison. She watched with carefully concealed satisfaction as he showed no sign of recognition. Why would he? The Maddie he knew wore flowery dresses and minimal makeup, her hair wild and untamed. This Madison was a weapon wrapped in Chanel and Christian Louboutin, every detail calculated for maximum impact. "Of course," he replied, gesturing them into his office. The space had changed, modernized, colder somehow. The only familiar thing was the view of Boston Harbor, where they had shared their first kiss during a charity gala. Madison pushed the memory aside as she took her seat, crossing her legs elegantly. "Madison Reynolds," she introduced herself, extending her hand. His grip was firm, impersonal. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." Blake settled behind his desk, scanning her resume with practiced efficiency. "Your experience is impressive, Mrs. Reynolds. Though I have to ask, why leave a senior position at Morgan & Associates for an EA role?" Madison had rehearsed this answer countless times. "I believe in being intentional about career moves, Mr. Harrison. Morgan & Associates is an excellent firm, but Harrison Enterprises is breaking new ground in sustainable technology. I'd rather be part of something innovative, even in a different capacity, than remain comfortable in a role that stopped challenging me." She watched his expression shift subtly. He'd always been drawn to ambition, to people who thought bigger than their current circumstances. It was what had attracted him to her originally, before he decided her ambitions weren't the right kind, weren't polished enough for his world. "And your family situation?" he asked, a standard question that made her blood run cold. "This position requires considerable flexibility with hours and travel." Madison's smile didn't waver. "No complications there. I'm quite independent." The lie tasted bitter, but she thought of the twins, safe with Sarah, and reminded herself this was all for them. They deserved to know their father, even if he didn't deserve them. The interview continued for another 15 minutes, a perfect dance of professional questions and calculated answers. By the end, Madison could see Blake was impressed despite himself. She had crafted herself into exactly the type of person he would want running his office, sophisticated, intelligent, and apparently without personal entanglements. "When can you start?" he asked finally, closing her file. Madison allowed herself a small, victorious smile. "How about Monday?" As she left his office, head held high on still steady legs, Madison felt Blake's eyes following her. She wondered if somewhere in his subconscious, some part of him recognized her walk, her gestures, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. But even if some ghost of memory stirred, he would dismiss it. After all, Blake Harrison had made it clear that Maddie Foster wasn't worth remembering. Walking back to her car, Madison pulled out her phone and dialed Sarah. "How are they?" "Having the time of their lives in the pool," Sarah replied. "How did it go?" Madison slid into the driver's seat, finally allowing herself to tremble slightly. "Phase 1 complete. I start Monday." She paused, watching the towering Harrison Enterprises building in her rearview mirror. "He didn't recognize me, Sarah? Not even a flicker of doubt. Is that good or bad?" "Both," Madison admitted, starting the car. "It makes things easier, but—" She trailed off, remembering how it felt to be in that office again, to be so close to him. "I thought there would be something. Some sign that what we had was real, that it meant something to him." "Maddie," Sarah's voice softened, "are you sure about this? It's not too late to dash." "I can hear the twins laughing," Madison cut her off, smiling at the joyful sounds in the background. "That's what this is about now. Not him. Not us. They deserve to know where they come from, Sarah. And he deserves to know what he threw away." Madison's first week at Harrison Enterprises proved more challenging than she'd anticipated, but not for the reasons she expected. The work itself was simple enough. She'd spent years preparing for every aspect of this role. What she hadn't prepared for was the constant proximity to Blake, the way his cologne still made her pulse quicken, or how his rare genuine smiles brought back memories she'd thought were safely buried. Thursday afternoon found her organizing his private files, a task that required her to work in his office while he was at lunch. Madison had just accessed his personal drive, her IT background finally proving useful, when Blake returned unexpectedly. She quickly switched screens to the scheduling software, but not before seeing something that made her blood run cold, a folder labeled Foster Properties Acquisition. "Everything all right, Mrs. Reynolds?" Blake asked, loosening his tie as he walked in. He'd been at a working lunch with the board of directors, discussing the company's expansion plans. "Perfect timing, Mr. Harrison," Madison replied smoothly, ignoring the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "The Tokyo investors confirmed for next week's video conference. I've adjusted your schedule to account for the time difference." Blake nodded, dropping into his chair with uncharacteristic weariness. "What would I do without you already?" The words were casual, but they struck Madison like physical blows. He'd said almost the exact same thing to her years ago, the night he proposed. "I'm sure you'd manage," she answered, keeping her voice light as she gathered her tablet. "Though your coffee wouldn't be nearly as good." It was a calculated risk, that hint of playful banter. She needed him to trust her, to see her as more than just another employee. "Speaking of which," Blake gave her a hopeful look that was so familiar it hurt. "Already on it." Madison stepped out to the executive kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared his coffee. "Black, 1 sugar. Something's never changed." Her mind raced with questions about the folder she'd discovered. Foster Properties had been her parents' small real estate business, the one they'd lost shortly after Blake threw her out. She'd always suspected his involvement, but proving it had been impossible. When she returned with his coffee, Blake was on the phone, his voice carrying that edge of controlled anger she remembered all too well. "I don't care what it takes, James. Those properties need to be cleared by the end of the month." The people there knew this was temporary. Madison set down his coffee, her mind flying to the folder she'd seen. Was he still doing it? Buying up small businesses, forcing people out of their homes? She thought of her parents, who died 2 years ago, still believing they'd failed at business, never knowing they'd been deliberately destroyed. "Mrs. Reynolds," Blake called as she turned to leave, "I need you to clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon. Something's come up." "Of course." Madison pulled up his calendar on her tablet. "Should I reschedule the meeting with the Sustainability Committee?" "No need. You can handle that one." He took a sip of his coffee, closing his eyes briefly in satisfaction. "Just brief me on the key points afterward." Madison froze. This was exactly the kind of trust she'd been working to gain, but something felt off. Blake Harrison never missed meetings about sustainable technology. It was his pet project, the cornerstone of his public image as a socially conscious CEO. "Are you sure? The committee has been waiting for your input on the new solar panel initiative." Blake's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something hard and cold crossing his features. "The committee will understand. This other matter is more pressing." He turned back to his computer, clearly dismissing her. That evening, after ensuring Blake had left for the day, Madison accessed his private calendar through a back door she'd created in the system. Tomorrow afternoon, meeting at Carlton Heights. Her stomach clenched. Carlton Heights was a struggling working-class neighborhood, exactly the kind of area her parents used to help develop. Walking to her car, Madison called Sarah. "How are they?" "Fast asleep. They made you about 12 drawings today. Emma says you have to hang them all in your new office." Sarah paused. "You sound stressed. What's wrong?" Madison slid into her car, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. "I found something, Sarah, about what really happened to my parents' business. And I think he's about to do it again to other families." "Maddie?" Sarah's voice carried a warning. "Remember why you're there. The twins dash." "This is about the twins," Madison cut in. "What kind of mother would I be if I let him keep destroying people's lives? What do I tell them when they're older and ask about their grandfather's business? That I knew their father was behind it and did nothing?" She started the car, her mind already racing with plans. "I need you to keep them tomorrow night too. I have to see what he's doing at Carlton Heights." "Be careful," Sarah urged. "If he catches you, dash." "He won't." Madison pulled out of the parking garage, the setting sun casting long shadows across the city. "He never saw me coming 7 years ago, and he doesn't see me now. That's his weakness. He only sees what he expects to see." As she drove home, Madison thought about the twins, about her parents, about all the lives Blake Harrison had carelessly ruined in his pursuit of more power, more money, more everything. Her original plan for revenge had been simple: make him fall for Madison Reynolds, then reveal she was the wife he'd discarded, the mother of his children. But now she had the chance to do something bigger. Something that mattered. Looking at her reflection in the rearview mirror, Madison hardly recognized herself. Not because of the expensive clothes or the perfectly styled hair, but because of the fierce determination in her eyes. 7 years ago she'd been a victim. Now she was a weapon. And she was about to show Blake Harrison exactly how dangerous underestimating her could be. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. Madison spent Friday morning in a state of hyper-awareness, every interaction with Blake feeling like a complex dance on the edge of a knife. She noticed things she'd been too focused to see before. The way his hands sometimes shook slightly when he was stressed, the new lines around his eyes that appeared when he thought no one was watching. Part of her wanted to hate how human he seemed, how it complicated her neat narrative of him as a heartless monster. The Sustainability Committee meeting is at 2, Madison reminded him, setting down his morning coffee. She'd added an extra dash of cinnamon, the way she used to make it when they were married. A small test. Blake took a sip and paused, something flickering across his face. "This is different," he said, studying the coffee. "Good different." "Just trying something new," Madison replied smoothly while her heart raced. "About the meeting dash. You'll handle it," he cut in, his voice hardening. "I have more pressing matters to attend to." He checked his watch. The Patek Philippe she'd given him for their first anniversary, she noticed with a jolt. "Make sure no one disturbs me for the next hour. I have some calls to make." Madison nodded and left his office, closing the door behind her. Through the glass walls, she watched as he pulled out a burner phone. Definitely not standard CEO behavior. She activated the small recording device she'd hidden in his office weeks ago, disguised as a new USB charger. Blake might be careful about his calls, but he'd never suspect his own space was compromised. The afternoon unfolded according to plan. Madison expertly handled the Sustainability Committee meeting, her genuine knowledge of environmental technology surprising even herself. Meanwhile, her hidden recorder captured Blake's conversations about Carlton Heights, discussions about pressure tactics, and accelerated evacuations that made her skin crawl. At 4 o'clock, Blake left for his mysterious meeting. Madison waited exactly 7 minutes before following in her own car, thanks to the tracker she'd managed to place on his vehicle during lunch. The drive to Carlton Heights took them through increasingly run-down neighborhoods, a stark contrast to the gleaming downtown towers of Harrison Enterprises. She parked a block away from Blake's Mercedes, pulling on a baseball cap and switching her designer blazer for a plain jacket. The neighborhood was a mix of small businesses and modest apartment buildings, reminding her painfully of the communities her parents used to serve. Now she could see signs of deliberate neglect. Broken windows that should have been fixed, maintenance issues clearly ignored. Blake emerged from a nearby building with James Tucker, his head of acquisitions, and several men Madison didn't recognize. Their body language screamed private security. She snapped photos with her phone, making sure to capture the faces of everyone present. "I want them out by next week," Blake was saying, his voice carrying in the quiet street. "If the holdouts won't take the buyout, make them understand their other options are worse. Some of these families have been here for generations," one of the men protested weakly. "The Martinez family's bodega dash is sitting on land that's about to be worth 10 times what they paid for it," Blake snapped. "I'm offering them fair market value. Their sentimentality is not my problem." Madison's hands shook as she recorded the conversation. This was exactly what had happened to her parents: mysterious property problems, rising maintenance costs, then finally a generous buyout offer when they were too broke to refuse. She'd never been able to prove Blake's involvement, but now, a sound behind her made Madison turn. Her heart stopped as she found herself face to face with a teenage girl, maybe 15 or 16, who was staring at her with suspicious eyes. "You're not from around here," the girl said, taking in Madison's expensive shoes, visible despite her casual disguise. Madison made a split-second decision. "No, I'm not. But I think I might be able to help." She glanced back at Blake and his men, then at the girl. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. "My mom's cafe. Around the corner." She started walking, then turned back. "I'm Rosa Martinez." Madison's heart clenched. "The Bodega family. I'm..." She paused. For the first time since starting this charade, she chose honesty. I'm someone who knows exactly what these men are capable of. And I want to stop them. Following Rosa, Madison sent a quick text to Sarah. Going to be late. Give the twins an extra kiss for me. Then she turned off her location services. What she was about to do went far beyond her original plan for revenge. But looking at Rosa, who was the same age she'd been when she first met Blake, Madison knew she couldn't walk away. The cafe was small but spotless, with faded photos on the walls showing 3 generations of the Martinez family. Rosa's mother, Elena, listened intently as Madison explained what she knew, what she suspected, and what she could prove with the evidence she'd gathered. Why are you helping us? Elena asked finally, her eyes sharp and assessing. Madison touched one of the family photos gently. Because 7 years ago, someone like Blake Harrison destroyed my family's business. No one stood up for us then. She straightened her shoulders, channeling every ounce of strength she'd built over the years. But I can stand up for you now. And what do you get out of this? Rosa asked, displaying the same skepticism Madison wished she'd had at that age. Madison thought of the twins, of the kind of person she wanted to be for them. A chance to make things right, she said softly. And maybe show my children that their mother knows how to fight for what's right, not just what's easy. As she laid out her plan to the Martinez family, Madison felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, not just for her parents, but for every family Blake Harrison had ever seen as collateral damage in his empire building. Her phone buzzed, a text from Blake's private number. Where are the files for tomorrow's merger review? Madison smiled grimly as she typed her response. She had him exactly where she wanted him. Trusting her completely, never suspecting that his perfect new assistant was about to become his worst nightmare. The weekend passed in a blur of activity as Madison juggled her expanding mission with her precious time with the twins. Saturday morning found her building pillow forts with Ethan and Emma, their laughter a stark contrast to the weight of the documents scattered across her desk, evidence of Blake's systematic destruction of small businesses across 3 states. Mommy, you're not doing it right, Emma giggled, rearranging the pillows Madison had just placed. The castle needs a tower. Yeah, and a moat. Ethan added, his blue eyes, so like his father's, sparkling with excitement. Madison helped them build their fortress, her heart aching at how Ethan unconsciously mimicked Blake's authoritative head tilt when directing the construction project. These moments with them were everything, yet she couldn't stop thinking about Rosa Martinez and her family, about all the other children whose homes and livelihoods were threatened by their father's ruthless ambition. Late that night, after the twins were asleep, Madison received an encrypted email from Elena Martinez. The Carlton Heights residents had met secretly and agreed to her plan. They would not go quietly. More importantly, they had records, years of suspicious accidents, questionable building code violations, and sudden tax reassessments that all traced back to shell companies Madison now knew were controlled by Harrison Enterprises. Sunday evening, as she prepared for another week at Harrison Enterprises, Sarah watched her with growing concern. You're taking on too much, her friend warned. The original plan was risky enough, but this, Blake Harrison has resources, connections. If he discovers who you are He won't, Madison interrupted, checking her makeup one last time. Blake's greatest weakness is his arrogance. He's so convinced of his own superiority that he'd never suspect his quiet, efficient assistant of orchestrating his downfall. She smiled grimly. Besides, I learned from the best. He taught me exactly how to destroy someone's life while looking completely innocent. Monday morning arrived with a fresh challenge. Madison entered Blake's office to find him agitated, pacing behind his desk. Mrs. Reynolds, cancel my lunch. The Carlton Heights situation is becoming complicated. Problems with the acquisition? Madison asked innocently, noting how his jaw clenched at her question. Nothing I can't handle. Blake ran a hand through his hair, a tell she remembered from their marriage, a sign he was genuinely worried. But I need you to prepare documentation for a press release. Something about urban renewal, community investment. The usual spin. Of course. Madison made a show of taking notes. Though, perhaps I could help more if I understood the full scope of the project? Blake studied her for a long moment, and Madison felt her heart rate spike. Had she pushed too far? But then he gestured for her to sit. What do you know about property development? More than you'd expect, Madison replied carefully. My parents were in real estate. This wasn't in her fake resume, but sometimes the best lies contained elements of truth. Something in her response seemed to resonate with Blake. He began explaining the Carlton Heights project, painting it as a visionary transformation of a declining neighborhood. Madison noticed he avoided mentioning the families being displaced, the generations of history being erased. His voice carried the same passionate conviction she remembered from their marriage. He truly believed he was doing the right thing. The holdouts are being unreasonable, he concluded, frustration evident in his tone. We're offering fair compensation. More than fair. But they're letting emotion cloud their judgment. Madison thought of Elena Martinez's proud face as she showed off her family photos, of Rosa's determined young eyes. Sometimes people value things that can't be measured in dollars, she said softly before catching herself. But I'm sure you'll find a solution that works for everyone. Blake gave her an odd look, and for a heart-stopping moment, Madison thought she'd revealed too much. But then his phone rang, James Tucker with more bad news from Carlton Heights. The residents were organizing, talking to the press. Someone had leaked documents suggesting Harrison Enterprises had deliberately created the conditions forcing them to sell. Madison maintained her professional mask as she witnessed Blake's controlled fury. She'd orchestrated this pressure campaign, using every trick she'd learned in the past 7 years. The leaked documents, the media contacts, the community organizing, all carefully arranged to seem like organic resistance. Get legal on the phone, Blake snapped. And find out who's behind these leaks. Someone's interfering with my business and I want to know who. Right away, Madison replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. As she left his office, she sent a prearranged signal to Elena Martinez. Phase 2 was about to begin, and Blake Harrison was about to learn that some things, like karma, couldn't be bought off or bullied into submission. Walking to her desk, Madison caught her reflection in the office windows. 7 years ago, she'd been a victim of Blake's ruthless business practices. Now she was using every tactic he'd ever employed against him, and she was doing it better than he ever had. Because unlike Blake, she understood the power of the people he saw as disposable. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, twins asking when you'll be home for dinner. They miss you. Madison touched the screen gently, looking at the photo Sarah had attached, Emma and Ethan doing their homework at her kitchen table, their dark heads bent together conspiratorially. Everything she was doing, every risk she was taking was for them. To show them that their mother wasn't just the woman Blake Harrison had discarded. She was someone who fought back, who stood up for what was right. And soon, very soon, Blake would understand exactly what he had created when he threw her away. 2 weeks of carefully orchestrated chaos had transformed Blake Harrison from a confident CEO into a man barely containing his rage. Madison watched from her desk as he paced his office, barking orders into his phone. The Carlton Heights situation had exploded beyond his control. Residents were picketing Harrison Enterprises, social media was ablaze with their stories, and investigative reporters were asking uncomfortable questions about similar patterns in other neighborhoods. I don't care what it costs, Blake snarled into his phone. Make this go away. He slammed the device down, then pressed the intercom. Mrs. Reynolds, get in here. Madison smoothed her skirt and entered his office, maintaining her perfectly composed facade despite her racing heart. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the new stress lines on Blake's face. What can I do for you, Mr. Harrison? Damage control. He thrust a stack of papers at her. The press is having a field day with these community interest stories. I need you to draft responses, set up interviews with sympathetic outlets. Paint the real picture, how we're investing in urban renewal, creating jobs. Of course. Madison accepted the papers, careful not to let their fingers touch. Though, perhaps a different approach might be worth considering? Blake's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? These families, their stories are resonating with people. Fighting them publicly might do more harm than good. Madison held his gaze steadily. What if you met with them? Showed a more human side of Harrison Enterprises. Negotiate with them? Blake scoffed, but Madison caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. That's not how business works, Mrs. Reynolds. Times change, Madison replied softly. Sometimes adapting is smarter than fighting. Before Blake could respond, his private line rang. Madison turned to leave, but his sharp intake of breath made her pause. She watched as the color drained from his face. What do you mean, pulled out? He demanded into the phone. The funding was guaranteed. He listened for a moment, then slammed the phone down. Damn it. Bad news? Madison asked, knowing exactly what had happened. The private equity firm backing the Carlton Heights development had withdrawn, thanks to some carefully leaked documents and a few strategic conversations with their board members. Nothing I can't handle. Blake's voice was tight with suppressed fury. He reached for the bottom drawer of his desk, where he used to keep his emergency bourbon, Madison remembered. His hand froze halfway there, and for a moment she saw raw vulnerability in his expression. "Would you like me to get you something?" she offered, fighting the instinct to comfort him as she once would have. "No." He straightened, mask back in place. "But clear my schedule for the rest of the day. And get me everything we have on the Martinez family. They're the ringleaders in this mess. There has to be something we can use." Madison's blood ran cold. "Use? Everyone has secrets, Mrs. Reynolds." Blake's smile was harsh. "Everyone has something they don't want exposed. Find it." Madison nodded and left the office, her hands trembling slightly as she closed the door. She'd known this was coming. It was exactly what he'd done to her parents, digging up old tax issues and minor code violations, transforming them into weapons. She pulled out her phone and sent a warning to Elena Martinez. They'd prepared for this, but seeing Blake's ruthless side emerge still shook her. This was the man who had destroyed her family, not the charming executive who smiled at charity galas. At her desk, Madison began her usual end-of-day routine, hyper-aware of Blake watching her through the glass walls. A photo on her phone caught her eye. Sarah had sent a picture of the twins at their dance class. Emma was mid-twirl, her face pure joy, while Ethan watched his sister with a patient indulgence that reminded Madison so much of Blake's rare tender moments. The sight steeled her resolve. Her children deserved to know both sides of their heritage, the warmth of the community she came from and the power of their father's world. But they also deserved to know the truth about right and wrong, about standing up to bullies no matter how rich or powerful. Madison gathered her things, sensing Blake's eyes still on her. She'd seen that predatory look before. He was planning something drastic. But this time she was ready. The Martinez family's records were pristine, their permits all in order. She'd made sure of that weeks ago. "Mrs. Reynolds," Blake called as she reached the door. "About what you said earlier. Arranging a meeting with the residents. Make it happen." Madison turned, surprised. "You're willing to negotiate? Let's call it, exploring options." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes you have to let people think they're winning before you show them how badly they've lost." Walking to her car, Madison felt a chill despite the warm evening. Blake was planning something beyond his usual tactics. She pulled out her phone and dialed Sarah. "How are they?" "Missing you," Sarah replied. Emma asked again why you're working so late. Madison watched the sun setting behind Harrison Enterprises Tower. "Tell them Mommy's fighting dragons." "Maddie?" Sarah's voice was worried. "Be careful. The closer you get to winning, the more dangerous he'll become." "I know." Madison started her car, thinking of the look in Blake's eyes. "But he taught me well. Never show mercy to dragons, they only understand power." The next morning would bring phase 3 of her plan. Blake thought he was setting a trap, but he was walking into one instead. 7 years ago, he'd taught her that love was weakness. Now she would show him that love, for her children, for her community, for justice, was the greatest power of all. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. The meeting was set for Thursday evening at the Carlton Heights Community Center. Madison spent the morning coaching Elena Martinez and the other residents, while carefully maintaining her role as Blake's efficient assistant. She'd chosen the venue deliberately. The shabby but dignified building held weekly dance classes, ESL courses, and senior citizen gatherings. It was exactly the kind of community hub that Blake's urban renewal would destroy. "Mrs. Reynolds," Blake called from his office around noon. "Join me for lunch. We should discuss strategy for tonight." Madison's pulse quickened. Lunch alone with Blake wasn't part of her plan. "Of course," she replied smoothly, gathering her tablet. "The usual place?" He smiled, and for a moment she saw the man she'd fallen in love with years ago. "I was thinking somewhere new. There's a French place that just opened on Beacon Street." The restaurant was intimate, elegant, and far too reminiscent of their early dating days. Blake ordered wine for both of them, a Bordeaux that had been her favorite when they were married. Madison declined politely, noting the flash of irritation in his eyes at her refusal. "Tell me, Mrs. Reynolds," Blake said as their appetizers arrived, "what made you really come work for Harrison Enterprises?" Madison took a careful bite of her salad, buying time. "As I mentioned in my interview, I admire the company's innovation dash." "Please." Blake cut her off with a wave of his hand. We both know there's more to it. You're overqualified, obviously ambitious, and yet you took an assistant position. Why? She met his gaze steadily, letting a calculated amount of truth show through. Sometimes the direct path isn't the most effective one. Ah. Blake sat back, studying her with new interest. You're playing a longer game. I can respect that. He took a sip of wine. That's why I wanted to discuss tonight's meeting privately. I think you and I understand each other. Madison felt a chill despite the restaurant's warm atmosphere. How so? We both know what it takes to succeed in this world. Blake leaned forward slightly. These people at Carlton Heights, they're living in the past. Progress isn't pretty, but it's necessary. I need someone who understands that to help manage this transition. What exactly are you proposing? A promotion. Blake's smile was predatory. Executive Vice President of Community Relations. You'd handle all our sensitive property acquisitions. Your bonus structure would be very generous. Madison forced herself to appear thoughtful, while her stomach churned. This was exactly how he operated, finding people's price, buying their complicity. That's quite an opportunity. Think of it as a partnership. Blake reached across the table, his fingers brushing her hand. Madison fought the urge to recoil. Someone with your intelligence, your understanding of how things work. We could do great things together. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Madison withdrew her hand carefully, pretending to reach for her water. The meeting tonight will proceed as planned. Blake's voice hardened slightly. But afterward, I'd like your answer. I think you'll find I can be very generous to my allies. Back at the office, Madison locked herself in the bathroom, fighting waves of nausea. Blake's lunch invitation hadn't been spontaneous. He'd been testing her, looking for an accomplice. Just like he'd done with others before, turning them into instruments of his corruption. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. Ethan's running a fever. He's asking for you. Madison's hands shook as she typed her response. On my way. She gathered her things, then stopped by Blake's office. Mr. Harrison, I need to leave early. Family emergency. Blake looked up sharply. Family? I thought you said . My friend's child, Madison improvised smoothly. I'm listed as their emergency contact. She saw the approval in his eyes. He liked that she'd lied on her application about having no commitments. It confirmed his belief that she was as pragmatic as he was. Of course. But you'll be back for the meeting? Wouldn't miss it. Madison smiled, channeling all her years of practice at hiding her true feelings. At Sarah's house, she found Ethan curled up on the couch, his cheeks flushed with fever. Emma sat beside him, reading him a story with their father's determined concentration. Madison gathered them both in her arms, breathing in their familiar scent. I don't feel good, Mommy, Ethan mumbled against her neck. I know, baby. Madison stroked his hair, feeling his temperature. But Mommy's here now. Are you still fighting dragons? Emma asked, remembering Sarah's explanation for their mother's long hours. Madison looked at her daughter, so innocent, yet so perceptive. Yes, sweetheart. But sometimes dragons try to trick you into joining them instead of fighting them. That's silly, Emma declared. Dragons are bad. You can't join them. Out of the mouths of babes, Madison thought. She'd been wavering, wondering if she could use Blake's job offer to gather more evidence. But her daughter was right. There was no compromising with dragons. As she held her sick son and watched her daughter's protective hovering, Madison made her decision. Tonight's meeting wouldn't go as either she or Blake had planned. It was time to stop playing his game entirely. She pulled out her phone and sent a group text to Elena Martinez and the other community leaders. Change of plans. Bring everyone tonight. And I mean everyone. The Carlton Heights Community Center was packed well beyond capacity when Blake arrived that evening. Instead of the small group of community leaders he'd expected, he found himself facing hundreds of residents. They filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled out into the parking lot, families with children, elderly couples, small business owners, all watching him with unified determination. Madison stood near the back, her professional mask firmly in place despite her racing heart. She'd left Ethan resting comfortably with Sarah, his fever finally breaking. His illness had crystallized something for her. How many other children's lives would be upended by Blake's schemes? How many other families would be torn apart? What is this? Blake demanded as he reached her side. This isn't what we discussed. The community wanted to be heard, Madison replied calmly. All of it. Before Blake could respond, Elena Martinez took the microphone at the front of the room. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice steady and clear, "you wanted to negotiate. But first, we'd like you to meet the people you're negotiating about." What followed was nothing like the civilized business discussion Blake had anticipated. One by one, residents came forward to tell their stories. Mr. Chin, who'd run his pharmacy for 40 years, filling prescriptions even for those who couldn't pay. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daycare center had helped raise 3 generations of Carlton Heights children. The Sullivan brothers, whose auto repair shop had kept countless families mobile and employed dozens of local youth. Madison watched Blake's face as the stories continued. She saw him shift from annoyed to uncomfortable to genuinely unsettled. These weren't the nameless obstacles he was used to dealing with. They were real people with real lives and deep connections to their community. "This is all very touching," Blake finally interrupted, his voice tight with controlled anger, "but business is business. Progress requires change." "Progress?" A new voice cut through the murmurs. Rosa Martinez stepped forward, holding a laptop. "Is this what you call progress, Mr. Harrison?" She connected the computer to the room's projector, and Madison held her breath. This wasn't part of her original plan, but when Rosa had called earlier with what she'd discovered, Madison had known it was time to improvise. On the screen appeared internal Harrison Enterprises emails, messages Madison had helped Rosa uncover through her access to the company's servers. They detailed the systematic harassment of small business owners, the deliberate neglect of properties, the targeted building code violations. But worse were the candid discussions about undesirable elements and demographic optimization. Blake's face went white, then red with fury. He turned to Madison. "How did they get these?" "Maybe you're not the only one who knows how to play the game," Madison replied softly, watching realization dawn in his eyes. "You." He grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "Who are you really?" The room had gone silent, everyone watching their confrontation. Madison looked at his hand on her arm, then into his eyes. "Someone who learned from the best, Blake. You taught me everything I know about destroying people's lives." His grip loosened as confusion crossed his face. Then, finally, she saw it, the first flicker of recognition. "Maddie?" "Hello, darling." Madison smiled, 7 years of pain and determination in her expression. "Surprise." Blake staggered back as if he'd been struck. "But, this is impossible." "Is it?" Madison stepped away from him, addressing the room but keeping her eyes locked on his face. "When Blake Harrison decided my family's business was in his way, he didn't just destroy it, he destroyed us. My parents died thinking they'd failed, never knowing they'd been deliberately targeted. Just like he's targeting all of you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Blake found his voice. "You're lying. This is some kind of setup, Dash." "The only lie," Madison cut in sharply, "was everything you ever told me. About love, about marriage, about family." She paused, watching him process her words. "About our baby." The color drained from Blake's face. "Baby? What baby?" "Babies, actually." Madison's voice carried clearly in the silent room. "Twins. They're 6 now. They have your eyes." Blake groped for a chair, sitting heavily. "Twins? You were, when you threw me out." "Yes." Madison's professional mask cracked, letting decades of pain show through. "I tried to tell you that night, but you were too busy explaining how I didn't fit into your world, how I was just a fun distraction." The room had gone deathly quiet. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Madison felt tears threatening but forced them back. "But you were right about one thing, Blake. I didn't fit in your world, not then. So I built myself into someone who could. Someone who could beat you at your own game." She gestured to the screen, still showing his damning emails. "Everything that's happened, the media attention, the investors pulling out, the leaked documents, that was me. Consider it 7 years of overdue child support." Blake started to speak, but Elena Martinez stepped forward, placing herself between him and Madison. "I think we're done here, Mr. Harrison. Unless you'd like us to share these emails with the press? I'm sure they'd love to know how Harrison Enterprises really conducts business." Madison watched her former husband, the man she'd once loved, the father of her children, the architect of her pain, as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. His face went through a cascade of emotions: shock, anger, fear, and finally something that looked almost like respect. "What do you want?" he asked Madison quietly. "From you?" "Nothing." Madison straightened her shoulders. "But these people? You're going to make it right. All of it. Starting with Carlton Heights." As the implications of her words sank in, Madison felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This wasn't how she'd planned her revenge, but standing here, surrounded by a community fighting for their homes, she realized it was better. She hadn't just beaten Blake, she'd become something he could never understand. Someone who fought for others, not just herself. The real victory wasn't in destroying him. It was in showing her children, through her actions, that sometimes the biggest dragons could be defeated not by becoming like them, but by bringing people together to stand against them. The aftermath of Madison's revelation unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake, aftershocks rippling through the stunned community center. Blake remained seated, his usual commanding presence shattered, while residents whispered and pointed phones at the condemning evidence still displayed on the screen. "Twins?" Blake repeated, his voice hollow. "I have children?" "Yes," Madison replied coldly. "Though you lost the right to call them yours 7 years ago." Elena Martinez was already organizing the crowd, directing people to document everything on their phones. The emails, the photos, the testimony, all of it would be backed up and distributed before Blake could even think about damage control. "I want to see them." Blake stood suddenly, taking a step toward Madison. Several community members moved protectively closer to her, but she held up a hand to stop them. "No." Madison's voice was firm. "You don't get to walk back into their lives just because you've been caught. They're not a business transaction you can renegotiate. They're my children." Blake's composure cracked completely. "You had no right to keep them from me. Like you had no right to destroy my family's business?" Madison shot back. "No right to target these people's homes? You gave up your rights the moment you decided power was more important than people." The room went silent as Blake moved closer, his face a storm of emotions. "I've changed, Maddie. These past few weeks working with you. Even not knowing who you were, I felt something different. Something real." Madison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You felt attraction to power. To someone you thought was like you. That's not change, Blake. That's just recognizing yourself in a mirror." "Mrs. Harrison, or Miss Foster?" Rosa Martinez stepped forward, tablet in hand. "There's something else you should see." She pulled up a new document on the projector screen, and Madison's breath caught. It was an email chain from 7 years ago, discussing her parents' business. "Where did you find this?" Madison asked, her voice shaking slightly. "In the archived servers," Rosa explained. "It goes deeper than we thought. Mr. Harrison didn't just target your family's business. He orchestrated their entire financial collapse. Look at the date." Madison scanned the emails, her professional mask crumbling as she read. The date was 3 months before she'd even met Blake. "You." She turned to him, understanding dawning. "It wasn't because of our marriage falling apart. You targeted them first. Meeting me was just convenient." Blake's face showed real fear now. "Maddie, let me explain. My father died thinking he'd failed." Madison's voice rose, years of pain breaking through. "My mother spent her last years working 2 jobs to pay back debts that you deliberately created. And all that time you let me believe, you made me think." She stumbled slightly and Elena caught her arm, steadying her. The older woman's touch grounded Madison, reminding her of all the other families in the room, all the other lives Blake had tried to destroy. "Mr. Harrison," Elena's voice cut through the tension, "I believe it's time for you to leave. Your lawyers can contact us about the Carlton Heights situation. I'm sure they'll be very interested in minimizing the company's exposure when this all goes public." Blake looked around the room at the phones recording everything, at the faces of people who had seen behind his carefully constructed mask. But his eyes kept returning to Madison, and she saw something there she'd never expected: regret. "The twins," he said quietly. "What are their names?" Madison hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Their names are Ethan and Emma. They're smart and kind and everything you're not. And if you ever want a chance to know them, you'll need to prove you deserve it." "How?" "Start here." Madison gestured to the community center, to the families watching their exchange. "Show them, show me, that you can be something more than a man who destroys things for profit. These people aren't numbers on a spreadsheet, Blake. They're human beings. Learn to see that, really see it, and maybe someday you'll be ready to meet your children." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Blake looked at the emails still displayed on the screen, at the faces of the people he'd tried to displace, at the woman he'd underestimated so catastrophically. For the first time in his life he seemed genuinely lost. "I'll have my lawyers draw up new proposals for Carlton Heights," he said finally. "With community input and no displacement." "That's a start," Madison acknowledged. but only a start. As Blake left the community center, shoulders bowed under the weight of revelations and recriminations, Madison felt the last chains of her past falling away. She pulled out her phone and looked at her background photo, Ethan and Emma laughing at the park, their faces full of joy and possibility. "You did it," Elena said softly, squeezing Madison's hand. "You saved our homes." "We did it together," Madison corrected her. "And maybe we saved something else too." The crowd began to disperse, but not before hundreds of phones had captured everything. By morning, Blake Harrison's carefully constructed world would be changed forever. But as Madison walked to her car, she wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. She was thinking about healing, for herself, for her children, for this community, and maybe, if he was finally ready to learn, for Blake too. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. Later that night, Madison sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, gently stroking his forehead. His fever had broken completely, but she couldn't bring herself to stop checking on him. Emma was curled up next to her brother, having refused to sleep in her own bed while he was sick. Looking at them, Madison felt tears finally break free, not of anger or revenge, but of profound gratitude for these two precious lives that had given her the strength to survive, to fight, to become more than her pain. "They really do have his eyes," Sarah said softly from the doorway. "Are you going to tell them?" Madison watched her children's peaceful faces. "Eventually. When the time is right." She stood carefully, following Sarah to the living room. "They deserve to know their father, but only if he proves he can be the kind of person they deserve to know." "And you think he can change?" Sarah's skepticism was clear in her voice. Madison settled onto the couch, thinking about Blake's face when he learned about the twins, about the emails that showed his calculated destruction of her family. "I don't know. But what I do know is that revenge wasn't really what I needed. Taking him down didn't fix anything, it didn't bring my parents back, didn't heal old wounds. What healed me was finding purpose beyond my pain." Her phone buzzed with messages from Elena and other Carlton Heights residents. The story was already breaking across social media. Blake's carefully constructed empire of secrets was crumbling, but more importantly, communities across the city were beginning to speak up, share their stories, unite against the kind of predatory development that had destroyed so many lives. "Sometimes," Madison said, reading the messages, "the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about becoming strong enough to protect others from them. About turning your pain into purpose." The next morning, Madison took the twins to the Carlton Heights Community Center. The building was buzzing with activity, residents planning, organizing, sharing resources. Elena Martinez had turned the main room into an impromptu headquarters for what was quickly becoming a citywide movement. "Mommy, did you win?" Emma asked, watching the busy scene with curious eyes. "Did you beat the dragon?" Madison knelt down to her children's level, looking into those eyes that reminded her so much of Blake. "You know what, sweethearts? I learned something important. Sometimes beating dragons isn't about breathing bigger fire than they do. Sometimes it's about showing them a different way to be. Like teaching them to be nice?" Ethan suggested, his recent illness forgotten in the excitement of the moment. "Exactly." Madison hugged them both close. "And sometimes when you fight for what's right, you find out you're not fighting alone. Look around, all these people? They're dragon fighters too. They just needed someone to remind them how strong they could be together." Rosa Martinez approached them, carrying a stack of papers. "The lawyers are here, Mrs. Harrison. And your ex-husband's representatives want to talk about establishing a community development fund. With no strings attached." Madison stood, keeping her hands on her children's shoulders. "Tell them we'll meet tomorrow. Today is for family." She looked down at the twins. "Who wants to help Miss Elena organize her art class for the neighborhood kids?" As her children ran off to help, Madison watched them integrate seamlessly into the community she'd helped save. Here, in this shabby but vibrant building, she saw the future she wanted for them. One where they understood that true strength came not from power over others, but from standing up for what was right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Blake. "When you're ready to talk about them, I'll listen. And I'll try to deserve the chance to know them." Madison saved the message but didn't respond. Time would tell if Blake could truly change, if he could learn to see the world through eyes unclouded by greed and power. But that wasn't her responsibility anymore. Her journey had taught her that the best revenge wasn't in destroying those who hurt you, it was in building something stronger from the ashes of what they broke. As she joined her children in helping set up the art class, Madison thought about how far she'd come from that rainy night 7 years ago. She'd arrived in Boston seeking revenge, but she'd found something far more valuable. The truth that real power isn't in what you can take from others, but in what you can build together. That the strongest people aren't those who never fall, but those who rise up and help others rise with them. Looking at her twins, now happily directing other children in arranging art supplies, Madison smiled. They would grow up knowing both sides of their heritage, the power of their father's world and the strength of their mother's heart. But more importantly, they would know that the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in transforming your pain into purpose, your struggles into strength, and your revenge into redemption. "Hey Mom," Emma called out, waving her over. "Come help us make something beautiful." And in that moment, surrounded by community, watching her children bloom in the warmth of shared purpose, Madison knew she had found the truest revenge of all, not in destroying Blake's world, but in building a better one. If you enjoyed this video and want to support our channel, you can show your appreciation through super thanks. Every contribution helps us continue creating meaningful content that entertains and inspires. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more amazing stories. Thank you for being part of our journey.